Hi, everyone. Such an honor to be here today. So, we're in a turbulent time, and that's manifested in part by the increasingly severe and frequent droughts and floods that we see in the news and close to home almost every day. Our standard approaches to water involving trying to control it are failing increasingly often. So while researching my book, Water Always Wins, I traveled around the world and met many people who have a different culture around water and are instead innovating ways to work with water to reduce drought and flood. This woman I met in the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq. She is a Medan marsh dweller, and they have a 9,000-year-old culture of living on top of the wetlands. In the dominant culture, by which I mean Euro-North American culture that's been exported around the world via colonialism and capitalism, we tend to think of water as either a commodity if we don't have enough, or as a threat if we're worried about flooding. And that leads to this control urge. But the Medan and others I met around the world showed me that that is not an innately human approach. To the Medan, water is simply life and the source of everything they need. So they use the grass that grows in the marshes, Phragmites australis, which is invasive elsewhere but native there, as their primary building material, including this beautiful community center. It's built all of reeds. It's called the Mudif. And during the 9,000 years that the Medan have lived atop the marshes, thought by some scholars to be the biblical Garden of Eden, many irrigated civilizations have come and gone around them. And when those other civilizations fell, the water would retake the marshes, would take over these irrigation systems. Today, the Medan's way of life is threatened by upstream dams in Turkey and Iran that are decreasing water to the marshes. Still, the longevity of this culture pales in comparison to our own, and it's worth asking why. And I believe that the way that they relate to water is a big part of that. So climate change is definitely a factor in the increasing flood and drought that we're seeing around the world. Climate scientists predicted these trends decades ago, and we're seeing them now. But land use and biology are also affecting water extremes and the climate, a critical fact that is widely ignored. In the dominant culture, we often respond to floods and droughts by calling for more control, higher levees, bigger drains, more infrastructure, longer aqueducts. But our development is actually part of the problem. And it's not just the concrete infrastructure that is designed to control water, but urban sprawl, industrial agriculture and forestry, overgrazing, overpumping of groundwater. In the dominant culture, we concern ourselves with human needs, and that leads to a single-focused problem-solving, worried about scarcity, build a dam, bring in water from somewhere else, worried about flooding, build a levee, build a wall. But putting ourselves first in this way isn't working, and it's because that single focus ignores water's agency and water's complex relationships with soil and rock and microbes and plants and beavers and people. And by ignoring those complex systems, it damages them. And that's why our increased efforts of control actually increase flooding and scarcity. But this problem is also an opportunity to change our relationship with water. Instead of seeing water as a what, a commodity or a threat, many indigenous and land-based peoples around the world instead view water as a who, a friend or a relative. And that lens allows them to better see and understand water's relationships, including the relationship with people, and to understand that with rights comes responsibility for maintaining and caretaking these systems. So when I say that we have dramatically altered the water cycle, here's a few statistics. Humans have drained or filled as much as 87% of the world's wetlands. dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's large rivers. The land area covered by pavement in our cities has doubled just since 1992. Deforestation is increasing rainfall locally, regionally, and globally, and many of our practices desiccate and dry out the land and water systems. So instead of trying to solve one problem at a time, the water detectives, as I came to think of them, because they approach water with respect and curiosity. And these are engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, indigenous peoples, urban planners, farmers, ranchers, foresters, are instead asking a radical question: what does water want? And what I've come to understand is that what water really wants is a return of its slow phases that are particularly prone to our disruption. These are wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, and forests that absorb floods, clean water, store it for later, store carbon, and support life that maintains the health of these systems that in turn support us. So there is the beginnings over the last decade or two of a global slow water movement that is protecting and restoring water's natural slow phases in many ways that are harmonized with a local area's culture. Like slow food, slow water projects are unique to each place. They work with the local geology, ecology, and culture. They use systems thinking rather than single-focused problem solving. They're distributed across the landscape rather than centralized, which makes sense if you think about that 87% of wetlands that have been eradicated. Slow water is ideally local, helping us to understand the local water cycle and availability and work within it. It's an environmental justice issue. Levees, for example, may protect one community, but in so doing, by cutting off the river from its floodplain, they're raising the water level in the river, which increases flood risk for other communities who perhaps can't afford a levee. Dams, similarly, are an environmental justice issue. A 40-year survey of dams built around the world found that they brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. Slow water projects, finally, are community-facing or engaged. In some cases, the communities are actively managing these projects. In other cases, it's more of an educational component, but it's out there in the landscape, and people can understand the land-water interaction, which is so critical. So most slow water projects start with historical ecology, and this map is of South Seattle in the 19th century and today. And what happened to the Duwamish River there is very typical around the world. And the reason slow water practitioners start with historical ecology is because water always wins. Water is inclined to go where it wants to go, which is where it went before we subverted it. And so by mapping what used to be, we understand that homes built on wetlands are often the first to flood. And doing this kind of mapping allows cities to plan for when buildings turn over. Perhaps instead of building something else that's at risk of flooding, perhaps we can return that space to water and have a more resilient city. And just another comment on environmental justice. The people who are the receivers of this largesse of levees and dams might seem lucky, but in fact, they pay a price as well. A field called sociohydrology, which looks at the intersection of people and water, has identified something called the levee effect. And I think we've all seen this. An area floods, they build a levee, and then people look at all that area behind the levee and they think, wow, look at all that real estate to build more businesses and more homes. And water people have a joke about levees, which is there are two kinds, ones that have failed and ones that are going to fail. So by encouraging the people to move behind the levee, you're really just putting more people at risk. And similarly, dams that bring water from somewhere else just encourage more housing, more development, more agriculture in an area that doesn't have enough natural water supply to support that. So you're making more people vulnerable to that water cycle. And sociohydrologists have documented this again and again around the world. When you bring in water from somewhere else, you just increase demand. It's very much like when you build more lanes on the freeway and then you attract more traffic and you have gridlock again. So I want to tell you a couple of stories from my research. This one is set in Seattle, and in Seattle they used historical ecology to plan for the restoration of Thornton Creek, which was regularly flooding a road, a high school, and homes. And globally, the majority of urban streams are buried and built up on top of them, and ones that remain on the surface often look like this. First, they're deforested, then they're straightened. That causes kind of a fire hose effect, the ultimate in fast water, which scours, and so then it's armored to prevent erosion. I think the quintessential example is the LA River in that concrete channel. And this creates something that ecologists call urban stream syndrome, which is flash floods, unstable banks, heavy pollution, and waning life. So restoration of urban streams is typically involved removing the cement, putting back some curves, putting in some wood and boulders, making it look kind of habitat-y. But what ecologists found is that the life that was coming back wasn't very diverse. It was sort of a crows and cockroaches situation. And these restorations needed ongoing maintenance. So a biologist who worked for the city named Catherine Lynch realized it's not just the stream we see, but the stream that we don't see flowing underneath that channel. And this is not the groundwater, it's called the hyporeic zone, which is from Greek hyporeic, which is underflow. So there's another river that is moving downstream through the soil and rock, but orders of magnitude more slowly. And on a creek, it could extend 30 feet from the banks. On a large river, it can extend a mile on either side. So the entire river system is much larger than we generally think. And the hyporeic zone is home to all kinds of amazing critters, microbes, crustaceans, worms, aquatic insects. Salmon lay their eggs there. And these critters play a pivotal role in nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycling. It's basically like the stream's gut microbiome. And so that's why when the hyporeic zone is scoured away, the waterway has very little hope of staying healthy. It's like when people have health problems because their gut microbiome is unwell. So this project that Catherine Lynch conceived of to rebuild this missing hyporeic zone in an urban stream was the first in the world. That's her in the front in the purple. Yeah. They put back in some of the curves, they took out the cement, they carefully designed the rock and wood so that it would drive water down into the hyporeic zone. And because they did their historical ecology, the project was just 1,600 feet in a river that's 15 miles long. And yet, the reason this area was flooding is because it was a floodplain. So by returning the floodplain to the river, it had an outsized impact and has eliminated flooding in this area. To convince the city bean counters to do this thing that they had never heard of, the hyporeic zone, she partnered with scientists from local universities. And they did some studies. They studied the physical, was the water moving down into the hyporeic zone? And it was at 89 times more than before their project. It was absorbing floods. It was providing water through the dry season. In the West, we tend to think of a lot of our streams as seasonal, running only in the winter. But historically, a lot of streams did run year-round because they were supplied by that healthy groundwater table. And that also keeps the temperature more consistent, which is beneficial for salmon. They did a chemical study. They measured more than 1,900 pollutants, things like lawn fertilizer and brake pad dust that are just rushing off the urban concrete and diving into the stream. And they found that spending just 3 hours in a 15-foot section of the hyporheic zone reduced 78% of the chemicals by at least half. A few other markers of success. It's a wonderful place for the community. The city hasn't flooded, and Chinook salmon returned and spawned in this hyporheic zone they created. So Seattle is doing this in other streams now. It's being done elsewhere in Washington state, and they're getting a ton of interest from around the world in this technique. And I think it's just important to think about that complexity and all of the things that water is getting up to, all of these complex relationships. So forest management is another major way that we've disrupted the global water cycle. You know, tree roots help water move underground, they reduce flooding, and trees also create rain, of course, as they lift up groundwater and release that vapor into the air. And yesterday we heard Suzanne Simard, who told us about her work uncovering the connections among trees and underground fungal networks. There are other cutting-edge scientists as well working across disciplines, discovering connections among plants, water, and climate. So we know that climate is affecting the water cycle, increasing flood and drought, but water and biology are also affecting climate. Water phase change is the primary way that Earth releases heat, and healthy life systems with a balanced water cycle buffer water extremes and help to keep the climate stable. Scientists used to think that most rain came from evaporation over the ocean, but now they know that at least 40% on average over continents, as high as 70%, comes from evapotranspiration from plants and soil. And that vapor condenses into rain and falls again locally and regionally, something called precipitation recycling. And forests, with their rough surface, also help to create the rain because they are slowing the wind, and they're releasing particles, fungal spores, pollen, and bacteria, which also help that vapor condense into rain. And these forest exhalations feed into jet streams and atmospheric circulations, so they're seeding rain on the other side of the world. And on the flip side, forest loss can cause drought on the other side of the world. People used to think that the temperature difference between the ocean and the land is what pulled in the vapor, and that trees grew where rain fell. But atmospheric physicist Anastasia Makariva has showed that forests actively pull in the wind to deliver the rain that they need. Tree vapor condensing into clouds decreases local air pressure, which draws in more moist air from elsewhere. And she calls this the biotic pump. And that might sound radical to some ears, but it's really not, she told me. All organisms possess knowledge of physical laws that allow them to make use of the environment. We're not surprised when birds build nests. So this picture is from Kenya, where I reported for Water Always Wins, and there some of these principles are general knowledge. Decades ago, Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai said, "If you destroy the forest, the river will stop flowing, the rains will become irregular, the crops will fail." In Kenya, I met people who had seen their streams and springs disappear as forests were felled. And forest restoration projects and water-savvy farming techniques actually brought them back. So there's a lot of talk now about planting trees for carbon storage, but most of these projects don't consider trees' role in the water cycle. Instead, we're seeing that single focus again, right? This time about storing as much carbon as fast as possible. But that creates problems. Plantations of fast-growing pine or eucalyptus where they don't belong might take too much local water. Researchers have found that it's better to spend money protecting an area, providing alternative livelihoods for people, and letting trees replant themselves. And restoration done well in this way can improve rivers and underground water flow for long distances. Increased frequency and severity of fires is another thing that we're seeing with climate change. But here too, land management that interferes with the water cycle is making things worse, something that fire reduction policies largely ignore. This is Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is a place that's very special to my family, and 60% of it burned in the 2021 Dixie Fire. Visiting 2 years later, I saw a marked difference between the national park and the commercially logged forest just outside. The commercial forest was still completely dead, but the park was showing a ton of regrowth, and not all trees had burned, and not all burned trees were dead. The conventional wisdom about forest management is that protected forests with no logging have a fuel loading problem and increased fire severity. So that inspires these policies to clean up the forest. But a study of 1,500 fires in western US forests over 30 years found that, in fact, protected forests had a lower fire severity. Why? Industrial logging that clear cuts old trees, that transpire a lot of water, reduces rain and heats the climate. Industrial logging also removes understory plants and decomposes wood that creates a spongy, moist environment and severs trees from those mycorrhizal networks that unite trees into a stronger forest that can share resources. Industry often uses pesticides to kill non-deciduous species that have no commercial value, and those are less prone to burning. And the pesticides also kill organic matter in the soil. And soil with good organic matter content can hold orders of magnitude more water, which supplies water to the plants and also prevents things like runoff and landslides. So intact, healthy ecosystems help to balance water and climate extremes locally, regionally, and globally because they evolve together, said Makariva. And indigenous prescribed burning as part of that process. Replacing a primary forest with plantations of one or two commercial species, or keeping forests in an early successional state to maximize short-term timber revenues, disrupts the community's evolved ability to regulate the water cycle and climate. The most important thing people can do to protect human communities, Makariva told me, is to protect old-growth forests and connected vegetated lands. Simply stopping the ongoing destruction will slow down climate destabilization, she told me. A few other slow water approaches that I discovered while researching Water Always Wins include assisting beavers' recovery and return to the land, both as a hedge against drought and flooding. That they're being used to protect against flooding in the UK, and drought and fire here in the US, particularly as snowpack is melting. Reviving earlier people's elegant systems for making the most of local water, such as the amazing eddy system in Southeast India. Finding special geological features, such as paleovalleys, that were created by ancient rivers and using them to recharge groundwater when we get big storms like atmospheric rivers. Making urban areas more permeable, as China is doing with its Sponge Cities initiative. Water Always Wins, these are various editions from the North America, United Kingdom, China. And sooner or later, water always wins. So in the face of climate change, ecosystem collapse, water scarcity, we must shift our relationship with water. In the dominant culture, we really have this scarcity mindset, but taking care of natural systems also helps take care of us. If we let go of our impulse for control and instead collaborate with water, we can win too. Climate change and the degradation of these natural systems that give us life can feel really overwhelming. But what I took away from meeting these water detectives around the world is that slow water projects are really empowering. It's something that people can do in their own communities with their neighbors to make themselves, their neighbors, and their other than human neighbors more resilient to water extremes than climate change. So I hope as you move through your own place, you'll grow more curious about water and ask yourself, what does water want? And how and where can we hold space for water? Thank you.